This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The UN Human Rights Council opened a 4-week session in Geneva on Monday, with multiple emergencies from Afghanistan to Ukraine set to take centre stage. Just over 200 days since Russia invaded its neighbour, Acting High Commissioner for Human Rights Nada al-Nashif said that throughout Ukraine the suffering of the civilian population continues. A special independent commission of inquiry on Ukraine is due for the first time to deliver its findings on possible war crimes to the Council on the 23rd of September. It was tasked with investigating grave abuses in Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Sumy regions. Beyond the war-torn country, fuel shortages and food security concerns are now the norm in some of the world's poorest countries, the acting UN rights chief said.
I welcome and call for the full respect of the landmark agreement involving Russia, Ukraine, the United Nations and Turkey in July, which allowed the resumption of shipments of grain and other food supplies from Ukrainian ports. And I urge the international community to ensure that the food reaches the people who need it.
A staggering 50 million people live in modern slavery today, according to the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery report, which indicates that 28 million people had to do forced labour last year and another 22 million were trapped in forced marriage. The International Labour Organization, ILO, and International Organization for Migration, IOM, the two UN agencies behind the report, said that forced labour and arranged marriages have increased by around 10 million people in the last 5 years, with women and children affected most. According to the report's findings, modern slavery occurs in almost every country in the world and cuts across ethnic, cultural and religious lines. More than half of all forced labour and a quarter of all forced marriages can be found in upper middle income or high income countries. An estimated 6.3 million people in Sri Lanka now face moderate to severe acute food insecurity. That's the warning from UN humanitarians at the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and the World Food Programme, WFP, who've said that the situation in Sri Lanka will likely worsen because of poor agricultural production, price spikes and ongoing economic crisis. 2 consecutive seasons of poor harvests led to a nearly 50% drop in production. The country's sovereign debt default in April has also reduced imports of food grains, according to the FAO and WFP, who insist that immediate food assistance and livelihood programs are critical to ensuring that households receive nutritious food. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. The harmful impacts of climate change are taking us into uncharted territories of destruction, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said on Tuesday, in a fresh appeal to all nations to reject fossil fuels and respect the Paris Climate Agreement to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Mr. Guterres said that the latest science showed we are still way off track. He was referring to the United in Science report, coordinated by the UN World Meteorological Organization, WMO, whose main findings are that greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise to record highs, that fossil fuel emission rates are now above pre-pandemic levels, and that the period 2018 to 2022 is going to be the warmest on record. The number of weather, climate and water-related disasters has increased 5-fold in the past 50 years, the UN chief said, adding that it remained shameful that resilience building to climate shocks was still so neglected.
It is a scandal that developed countries have failed to take adaptation seriously and shrugged off their commitments to help the developing world. Adaptation finance needs are set to grow to at least $300 billion a year by 2030. I've just returned from Pakistan, where I saw firsthand the massive scale of need there. At the very least, 50% of all climate finance must go to adaptation.
Catastrophic hunger in Somalia has left more than 513,000 children at risk of dying, 173,000 more than during the 2011 famine, UN humanitarians warned on Tuesday. Without urgent action, famine will occur within the next few weeks, the Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, said in a call for immediate funding to help vulnerable communities hit by successive droughts, high food prices and conflict. James Elder from the UN Children's Fund UNICEF said that the number of severely acutely malnourished children had increased sharply from 386,000 in June to more than 500,000 today.
Children are already dying. Our partners report that some stabilisation centres are in fact full and critically ill children are having to receive treatment on the floor.
Drought-related deaths have already been reported in Somalia, UN humanitarians say, and there is deep concern that the toll could be much higher in hard-to-reach rural areas. The perilous situation for those forced from their homes by hunger in Baidoa town of Bay region in southern Somalia is also particularly concerning. To Nicaragua, where human rights abuses have continued to worsen in recent months, linked to the country's political crisis, the UN Human Rights Council has heard. In an update to the forum in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, said that it was particularly worried about the continued arbitrary detention of at least 195 people. 50 of these detainees were arrested during last year's elections and sentenced this year, some facing up to 13 years in jail. At least 28 of those still being held by police have had to endure reportedly inhumane conditions, and some have been refused access to their children, the Council was told, while the harassment of rights activists, journalists, the clergy and actual or perceived political opponents has continued. In one incident last month, the UN Rights Office described how dozens of police officers and anti-riot units raided a faith-based broadcaster and held the parish priest and 6 others captive for 3 days without electricity or food. Ahead of local elections in November, OHCHR said that it had serious concerns about them after 5 opposition party mayors were removed from office and replaced with government party members. Daniel Johnson, UN News. This is the news in brief from the United Nations. A violent escalation in the Syrian conflict is possible, top UN-appointed independent rights experts warned on Wednesday as they published their latest report into the near 11-year war. Head of the Commission of Inquiry on Syria, Paulo Pinheiro, said that another Turkish ground operation remains a threat in the north amid the continued mobilization and fighting between Turkish and Turkish-backed forces and Kurdish-led opponents. The flare-up has seen several deadly incidents in recent weeks, including the August shelling of a crowded market in Al-Bab city. 16 civilians were killed, including 5 children. Commissioner Lynn Welchman noted that Israel, the US and Iran-backed forces had also continued to engage in operations in Syria. The panel, which was appointed by and reports to the Human Rights Council, also noted that Russia still actively supports the Syrian government, particularly using airstrikes that have killed civilians and targeted food and water sources, including a well-known water station serving over 200,000 people, it said in a statement. Last week, fresh airstrikes caused further deaths and injuries in Idlib province, which are currently under investigation, the Commission of Inquiry said. The harsh realities of daily life in the occupied Palestinian territories have been well documented, and the past year has provided no relief, UN economists said on Wednesday. A new report on the situation in Gaza and the West Bank from UN trade and development body UNCTAD found that farming, industry and development all suffered in 2021. Today, for instance, the share of agriculture in the Palestinian economy is 6.5%, compared with over 12% in 1994. This is partly owing to the Israeli military operation in April 2021, which targeted and devastated farmland, crops, orchards, greenhouses and irrigation systems, and settler violence against Palestinians that hasn't been as bad since 2005, said UNCTAD's Mutassim El-Agra.
This violence includes destruction of property, physical assaults, intimidation, firing of live ammunition, uprooting and destruction of trees, crop vandalization, and so on.
Mr. El-Agra noted that Israeli settlements continued to expand last year, despite several UN resolutions condemning the practice, including Security Council Resolution 2334 from 2016. By November 2021, there were more than 138 settlements recognised by the Government of Israel and 150 unrecognised outposts, more than one-third of which had been built fully or partially on land acknowledged by Israel to belong to Palestinians, UNCTAD said. The people of Ukraine have shown incredible resilience since the Russian invasion more than 6 months ago, but they urgently need the ongoing support of the international community, the UN's Migration Agency chief has insisted. Antonio Vitorino, Director General of the International Organization for Migration, IOM, was speaking after his meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev. To date, many thousands of people have been killed in the conflict and more than 6.9 million have been internally displaced, Mr. Vitorino said, adding that another 7 million have fled across Ukraine's borders. Although international support has focused on the humanitarian emergency, the IOM chief maintained that support was also needed to sustain people's livelihoods and to help communities re-establish themselves. This can be achieved by supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, rehabilitating schools and repairing institutions that are providing vital support services, Mr. Vitorino said. To date, the UN Migration Agency has helped close to 800,000 Ukrainians with relief items, cash support and health services. Daniel Johnson, UN News.